presentation. And sometimes stuff my structure, and whenever I start, generally to prepare for a lecture or a presentation, I find myself deciding, often when I start to prepare for a research whenever my presentation starts to I often end up with this kind of I find myself with this kind of So this is the space where we are.
Yes.
The detail video shows a trace around my studio at the moment when I started the preparation for this lecture or this presentation or this video or this experiment right. Perhaps. And at the same time I was preparing, as I usually do when I make a new work, a list of bullet
just
points.
A work.
Topics,
so a lecture,
as a way of navigating how to answer the call to speak about my practice, my artistic practice and my research practice, and specifically the format within research, artistic research.
Yeah.
And I think these kind of map drawing tendencies, or this tendency I have, stems from the need I have to create order, or the difficulty I have, rather, in creating order in relation to what I'm doing artistically.
Yeah. To disclose.
And for me, this is one of the crucial elements of artistic research, how to distill in language or in concepts what one has been doing.
Yeah, not just what one's been doing, but also to distill some kind of, or to explore, or to expose the the research, or to expose or to shed light on the matters that have been explored in the practice. Okay, so I often start like this when I make a presentation, and as you can see in the current phase, the note-taking or the attempt to map starts to lead a life of its own, where it's no longer a map but more like a chaos or a jungle of possible concepts and ideas, and perhaps it would be good to elaborate a little bit on the structure of this presentation, how I've attempted to approach it as an experiment, and what some kind of markers of structure are to not lose ourselves in complete chaos. So first of all, it is an experiment. I am recording multiple layers. I have imported many elements into a video editing program and a live editing program also. So in a sense, it's both a live experiment, even though you're receiving this in a pre-recorded form. But I'm revisiting this space many times, and I'm also approaching the lecture or the presentation or this video or this space, whatever this space is that we are now occupying together over the course of this 1 hour period. I'm approaching this 1 hour as a space. And there are certain themes and blocks that I've identified that I would like to talk about. And both the way in which I want to talk about them, and the way in which I will attempt to leave space for the images to form some kind of argumentation, relates to the way I've been doing it in my practice, both artistically, how I treat objects in space or how I make spatial installations, as well as in relation to research. And it is also with that notion that I would like to start, with the notion of the research. So one of my notions, or one of the ways in which I experience my practice, but also, if you speak very generically, being alive, is as a collection of fragments, collection of things that are happening, an incredibly complex tapestry of things that are happening. And for the purpose of the PhD, I was able to approach these nodes, or these possible these things that are happening with a certain strategy. And it is also that strategy I would like to start this lecture with. So in a sense, I drew it here. So we're going to start by sort of the frames. If all these dots are elements or things happening in my practice, we're going to start with literally the frame I used in my PhD, the frame in language, the frame, but also the concepts I used, or the methods I used to describe it. And then that is the first part. And I aim to keep this within 20 minutes of the presentation. And then I will, because of the nature of a PhD, and we will see this when I'm talking about it, even though I've attempted to be very free and find formats that allow this fluidity and this permanent flux of a kind of field of research to be present also in the writing, also in the final result, so to speak. Of course, the nature of a PhD means there is some kind of rigidity, hence the drawing of the frame. And for the second part, poorly drawn here, my one, this handles, or this focuses on the postdoctoral research part, the part after my PhD, after completing my PhD, which involves freer works, or a research frame that is more free. Mostly the works I conducted there, or the works that I will focus on here, are conducted with a collective that I'm part of called Intermerz. It's a collective I have together with Konrad Klaas. And the second part will of the presentation will focus more on an experimental way of showing the research that is conducted in this field-like way, and how the relations work, but also this finer grain, so the fact that the bulkiness of the PhD was left behind, allowing for a different way of conducting, or maybe not conducting research, but more reporting on research or disclosing it, instead of this big behemoth which is a PhD, is more like an elegant dance move, smaller entities. And an example of that is the visual essay, of which I will discuss a few among this resonating mass of the works. But also the video essay, and we use self-published magazines, but the visual essays are published, but the magazines are also formats and vehicles that allow sort of a gathering of activities that took place within a space, things we did in space or spaces, as like the magazine is like the visual essay, and also like the video essay is a way to gather and reflect, but in a lighter way, in a smaller grain than in the PhD. Okay, so I will start with phase 1, which is the PhD block. And the funny thing is, it actually looks like a block. So the PhD is a box, literally, that consists of 7 books. One, well, the first 6 books are artist books that capture a range of projects conducted over the 4-year period, mostly spatial installations, exhibitions, or works in space. And the 7th book is it's the fat one, is the reflective component, in which I try to assume a position or a relation to these, to the works and the practice that is described in the other 6 books. This is the only book that contains a large amount of text. All of these other books are mostly visual. So an important part of the content of the work, of course, within the margins of this presentation, will remain rather invisible. I can perhaps only elaborate on very specific projects in the hope that they disclose something of the general nature. And of course, the other images that are visible also give a cross-section of the kind of work. This, for example, is the train track of my grandfather that I demounted after he passed away. And I used the materials as elements that I added to an archive and reinstalled it several times in different configurations. But in the book, it's very clear that the process of dismounting is also documented and is in fact part of the work, and in fact perhaps becomes more part of the work since neither the final installation since the final installation has disappeared. So this book, this document that captures not only this project but a series of these kind of projects, is all that remains. And in the same book, so this is the archive that I took to several locations to make new configurations, and that is a recipe that has been present in my entire practice. So in all of these books, there are locations, sites that I work in, and that are the fuel for producing new spatial work. But the process of discovering these places is also very much part of the documentation. So whilst these images play, that show a cross-section of many of these different projects that I can't elaborate on now, I will disclose how I attempted to relate to this, these many works, these 6 books of images, with words. And this was actually a rather prominent part of the research, the struggle. And at one point, in a prologue, I formulated as follows, that I initially wrote many different kinds of texts until I discovered that I needed a form that I had actually already been practicing or put into practice while I was doing the research, namely the form of the dialogue. Of course, when you're conducting research, you are conversing non-stop with fellow researchers, other artists, curators, random people you meet in the process of making the work. And in fact, it turns out that this form of the dialogue seemed to be a very suitable way to capture what I wanted to, or to be the right tone for a kind of questioning, hesitant way of constructing what I wanted to say from this field of spatial installations and works that I made. So I had the form, and quite immediately, or not immediately, but of course closely related to the dialogue form is the fact that one needs a partner to have a conversation with. And I actually developed 4 characters to do this. Felix, Edgar, Pavel, and Mers. And each of these 4 also represent a requisite or a requirement that is connected to the activity of writing a PhD. So Felix is the academic who attempts to relate the discourse or what is being talked about to a broader field of theory. Edgar is the artist who, of course, speaks from the point of view of the maker and questions words from that capacity. Pavel is the teacher, and of course, historically, a PhD is related to, it's like a test to see if one is able to converse or construct dialogue or construct argumentation in relation to a didactic practice. This is Pavel's job or his role in the dialogues. And the last is Mers, and she's a living being. This is of course related to the fact that I'm conducting the research in the field of architecture and interior architecture. In our faculty, it's the same faculty as the Faculty of Arts. So this questioning of space, not only because it was in my practice, for that reason was very present. And these conversations, these dialogues, start by questioning the dialogue form itself. So here Felix and Edgar are conversing about why they're conversing, about what the role of text should be in relation to artistic research, and what the role of text in relation to my work, in this case, can be and should be. And this quite quickly leads to a conclusion that they want to talk in real territories. And so they start conversing in one of my works. And based on 2 random works. And quite quickly, this way of conversing leads, so the first dialogue is about dialogues, leads to the notion that they need a real terrain. And this is very similar to the terrain that I just explained. I call it the field or the constellation. That is the 2nd chapter. And that refers to the way I experience the space or space whilst I'm making a work, but perhaps also space in general. I refer to it as a field, and a constellation in the chapter is developed as a distraction or a distillate, as a kind of compression or adaptation of elements in this field into a work of art. When does a situation in reality change into something artistic? What is required? And in this chapter, there are also examples of other artists. So external examples are introduced to speak parallel to the work. And from that point on, actually, it is never in direct relation to my own work that the words are formed. Then the third chapter is formulated by the teacher, actually, in the conversation about the field and the constellation. He formulates 3 typologies that he feels are still missing from the conversation, or that the conversation should tackle. That is the garden as a space that mediates between nature and culture, between intention and coincidence. And at the same time, he links verbs to these different typologies. So with garden also comes the notion of gardening, cultivating a small area of a smaller domain of the world, and working with the forces that are active there. And also there's a notion of taking care of, and a notion of spending time with, and of questioning one's authorship or authority, or the balance between things that just happen naturally and things that are consciously decided. Then the fourth chapter, the next typology, is that of the monument, which explores the physical object and physical space as a carrier of significance or cultural significance, like what is worth looking at, when is something not above nature, but when is something distinctly different from what we find in a natural way. And also this is connected to, so this conversation about the monument takes place in Berlin. And it creates a tension between like the personal monumentality of life and the collective kind of monumentality of a city or a society. And then the last chapter, as a sort of to close the typologies, is that of the house, with the action of dwelling that is connected. And this speaks about specific houses, being in a house or living in a space, lived space, dwelling in a house, but also dwelling on the earth. But also, it's because it's a PhD, rounds the characters and asks them about their way of being in the world after everything they've conversed about, after everything they've spoken about. That is the way in which the textual component is added to the series of works in my PhD. And as a bridge between this kind of, because even though they are dialogues and and initially and at some point they write letters, it is not a light and airy book. I mean, it's a big heavy thing, so it is a lot of talking, and the distance from the work is sometimes large. And in a quite natural way, after after the PhD, I was able to distill many projects that I was, or many of the results or the artistic works that I had made. I was able to look at them more freely once the PhD was completed. And a good example of this found freedom came in this visual essay that I made together with Peter Snowden, about a project that was already a collaborative project that I did with Camille van Bredam. He's the gentleman in red everywhere in the images. And I was able to collaborate with him in his studio and work with his materials over a longer period of time. And in the PhD, this resulted in one book, which was very much a closed project. And during my conversations with Peter, because I spoke with him about this work, we were able to shed a different light on this project. It is a completely different way. There are different matters that are touched upon that were never articulated within the context of my PhD. I re-examined all of the images that were in the archive and rearranged them in order to make an argument about my way of working, but also emphasize a certain kind of spatiality. And this freedom that to be able to almost reappropriate your own work, but also to revisit it in dialogue with other people, is actually something that I've done several times in several different visual essays. And it's interesting also to see how certain themes from the earlier trajectory keep recurring. So they keep being present: the monument, the garden, the house, many of the things touched upon. But at the same time, the notion of dialogue, of course, but at the same time, the field is broken open again and new resonances are found. So the same images might be reused again in a different context to make a different argument. So this space that I kept between my artistic work and these reflective texts in my PhD, I continue to adopt that strategy in order so that there is not a singular relationship between the fluid works and the actual works. There is not a fixed relationship that fixes the work in place. When reflecting upon since when reflecting upon artwork, there's always a risk of being trapped in what you've said about it. So this final example, or this next example, is, for instance, is a visual essay I wrote recently. Visual essay that departed from the exhibition that actually from a journal of interiors about collections, and they asked for alternative approaches. So I decided to write a visual essay, and the point of departure is actually the exhibition that rounded up my PhD, the exhibition for my defense, which in itself was already a place that gathered all the different works or all the different objects of all the projects that had been separate into a constellation in which they had never found themselves. So the objects mixed. But of course, that was also the point after the PhD from which a new trajectory departed, in which, like I said, the projects were not so delimited, and both the reflective space and the manner of reporting the research, as well as what was happening, how I was making works, became more fluid. It might practice with intimates, as we shall see, but also in itself. And I used this idea of new relations were formed from these old projects. Many of the images. I used this idea typologies as well, but also how the spaces that they originate from or relate to were brought together. Track of my grandfather. And this approach of they say something different. They say something about their own space. The nature of their collection, this idea how objects function in relation to is a good example of how they function together. New relations were formed from these old projects. Many of the images there were also certain typologies we've previously seen. For example, maybe a more formal approach to the work, tables with objects. I used this idea, stick-like objects, of stacked objects, leaning objects, and a series of spatial configurations of collections within their context, within their direct context that the objects originate from, but also when exhibited as a collection, and also when work or in the process of making a work. And these kind of discoveries, like these kind of visual collections, come from making works or these kind of processes in between. It's like making a work or in the process of everything, almost like on these pictures, like on this. And these kind of discoveries, like dumping everything into discoveries, these kind of visual, and then rearranging to see one example, which is the bridge to intimates. And which is the bridge to important part of final example, which is the bridge to intimates, a visual essay that I wrote with Kunrad, which is the bridge to intimates, about which is the bridge to intimates classes we were teaching, which is the bridge to intimates at the time, and the book we made. It was the first book. It was an impromptu decision to make it, based on images from our student works, and that's also the bridge. Yes, it's the bridge into intimates, where I will finally shut up and let the images do the talking. Shut up and let the images do the talking. Shut up and let the images do the talking.
Is goed, we kunnen gewoon zeggen wat we willen.
Hoi.
Welgekomen.
Ja.
Ah, bon, goed.
Dus, kastje?
Ja.
Kastje open?
Kastje open.
Archief van internet. Kastje open?
Kastje open. Onze publicatie zit er niet in.
Shit. Dit is internet.
Hi Remco,
Hi, Kunrad.
we are intermerds.
We are intermerds.
We are like 3D glasses in which we personify the left and the right eye of the collective respectively.
Our dialogue arises from distraction and coincidence, thus perhaps precisely from the specificity of a spatial, urban, or other kind of situation.
Because of the smallest divergence in perspective, the ideas translate from the projection of that idea to reality.
This can be in the form of a magazine, an exhibition, a video work, or a performance. In each of these cases, the strategy applied is determined by the context in which we find ourselves.
In that sense, we are more context-specific than site-specific. Yes,
Yes,
indeed.
indeed.
We
We could talk about spaces too.
Yes, we could talk about spaces too.
We try to introduce order into chaos in order to archive and grasp. Yes.
Yes. In this way, the archive itself becomes the subject of the exhibition. Not any ingredient is in itself or exists in itself.
Because the individual components are merely actors who must be able to perform various functions. This process also interrogates the quality of the archived ingredient.
They should be both redeemable when we talk about their formal aspects, as well as modular, multi-purposed, so that we can erase those formalities.
Through the copying movements, we reflect on the archive. Yes.
Yes. We're thinking out
We're
loud.
thinking out loud. We work out loud.
Some things will be used afterwards, and other things will be considered complete bullshit. Some things will be used afterwards, and some things will be considered bullshit.
Both consequences should be possible.
Both outcomes should be possible. Both should be possible. We reserve the right to fail. We reserve the right to fail. It's even part of our strategy. Seemingly unprepared, since we wish to be able to receive and translate a new context in an open-minded way that is as uncontaminated as possible. Otherwise, it's like walking into a new room with dirty shoes, which in the end will make this room resemble every previous room we ever walked in on. Which in the end will make it resemble every previous room we walked on. Shoes off.
Shoes off.
Shoes off. Barefooted through a room of thumbnails. Barefooted through a room of Barefooted through a room of thumbnails. Barefooted through a room full of thumbnails.
When you walk onto a thumbnail, at least you know you have to look if there's anything spelled out on the walls around you. Barefooted through a room full of thumbnails.
Questions?
Bijvoorbeeld dat dit ding nu in beeld is. Ophangen? Ja, maar dat is ook het doel van de ingrediënten. Dus misschien moeten we gewoon eens kijken. Is er nog iets anders waar we iets over kunnen vertellen? Want dat is iets van de ingrediënten. Er zit iets in. Ja, dat is vergelijken met spullen van hier. We werken met spullen die we vinden, zoals dit en dat.
Never was it you who broke the heart and made it new. It was Mara, this kid.
Testua ezin da osorik irakurri.
Dela, moros.
Bila, estudioa, kantarantza. Bruselasen. Hiru. Bai. Vertikala. Mugimendu vertikala. Eta zuloak. Zera falduko dugu? Eta txoriak edo non? Agian. Pareta, lurra, pareta, eta erdian mailan. Lurretik lurrera, eskura, gorputzera, bitxiak aldira. Jantziak. 3 jantzi. 3rontzat. 3, 3, 3.
Now you have the obligation to choose. If you have unorganized shit, you just forget about it.
Tamen bai da gauza. Kamioietan, gure gaztetzea. Eta gure arraina. Jolastuko gara? Bake partida? Soriona. Soria. Soriona. Eta jonkei.
But it needs some tension in the whole thing. So this one. And it needs some weight in there. Just something. And maybe a few blue ones, I don't know. Kan je ook timelapse filmen? Oh, make some pasta? Korean?
easy way, not even an easy way to order.
And also this can go on top of this because then the wire will just pull it out and just do it all. Yeah. Wow, beautiful. It's like a vanishing act.